What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Scouting the Fins here on the 3 Yards Per Carry podcast, also part of the 5 Reasons Sports Network. I'm joined by my co-host, Coach and Eric. Gentlemen, how are we doing today?
Doing all right. Looking forward to a fun episode here. Looking forward to talking about a little bit of a defensive line with our guest, Seth. And also looking forward to touch on the news that I'm sure everyone is having a very normal reaction to today.
Yeah, doing well also. And again, looking forward to talking to Seth here in a second. This is a guy who was drafted in the 4th round of the 1997 draft by the Jacksonville Jaguars. Then in the 2002 expansion draft, he was selected by the Texans. Started 99 games at defensive tackle in the NFL. And these days he's part of the Houston media, has his own show with Sean Pendergast. And, lots of things to discuss with him today. Want to get his thoughts on the 3 rookie defensive tackles with his experience. And then Seth actually played with defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver and crossed paths with Mike McDaniel, who both those guys were in Houston during Seth's last year there. And then also as a member of the Houston media, looking forward to get some of his thoughts on new Dolphins offensive assistant Bobby Sloic.
Yeah, 1997 and 1999. Eric, he's much, much older than the both of us, man. All right, we'll go ahead and bring in our special guest, Seth Payne. Seth, how you doing today?
I'm not that old. I'm not that old. I'm young at heart. I'm still. I don't consider myself an adult yet whatsoever, and I'm 50. So there you go.
All right, appreciate you coming on. Like I said, we're gonna kind of shotgun through a bunch of questions here, try to get as much in the half hour that we have with you. First question I got for you is on our first round pick, Kenneth Grant. So some people have labeled him as a nose tackle, but he played 70% of his career snaps in college in the B gap. And I do think that, Grant is fully capable of clogging up the middle when he's asked to. But do you see Kenneth Grant as a player who is capable of succeeding if the team needs him to line up in a 4 or a 5 technique a little wider?
Yeah, I think so. Depending on, when you're playing just the base 3-4 Okie or something like that, 100%. I honestly, I was psyched when you guys drafted him because I'm watching him and early in the process, and I keep seeing projections of him as being a 2nd round pick. Maybe he'll squeak into the late 1st round. And I kept checking the stats the first time I watched him. I was like, it says he's 340 pounds, but this guy, there's no way in hell this guy's 340 pounds. He's moving way faster. And maybe he was 330 at that point or whatever it was. But you just don't get guys that big that redirect as quickly as he does. And the other thing about him, too, was when I watched him the first time, I mistakenly was watching some 2023 film, and I could see some of the stuff that I had seen in the scouting reports maybe show up where he wasn't using his hands as effectively, et cetera. And then you fast forward to 2024, and he had progressed. He did exactly what you want to see out of a young defensive lineman. Every single year he got a little bit better. And I like Mason Graham a lot. I think the upside of a 330-plus pound guy that can move the way Kenneth Grant can, and he shows an aptitude and ability to read plays, a feel for the game that I thought it was a great pick. And it doesn't surprise me that Anthony Weaver chose him or Jordan Phillips, who's still confusing me because of your previous yeah. Jordan Phillips. But I think playing a 3-4 defensive end. When I first got to Houston, that was my first time playing in a 3-4. And they started me off as an end, a 3-4 defensive end, and they realized I was better at nose tackle. And I saw a lot of different guys kind of go through that transition. Sometimes the coaches don't even know until you get a guy into a defense and see exactly how he responds to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good follow-up question here, is particularly with Anthony Weaver and kind of seeing how, you mentioned that Kenneth Grant kind of makes sense for him. Anthony Weaver at least from what we can tell, absolutely loves Kenneth Grant, the person. And it kind of makes me a little curious about Anthony Weaver, the person, and kind of what he was like during his playing days with the Texans. If you could just go into that a little bit and just who he was when you were there.
So he got there in 2006, which was Gary Kubiak's first year. And he was kind of like one of the big free agent signings they made in Gary Kubiak's first year. And they brought him in because he'd been really good with Baltimore. And at Baltimore, I think a lot of the things that you're starting to see with this defense here, Rex Ryan might be a lunatic, but they play disciplined football, and they ask their defensive linemen to be pretty versatile, but physical and play with really good technique. And Anthony was just that. He was just dialed in on his technique, on the fundamentals of football. I never thought he was going to be a coach because Eric, you know this. Sometimes you can just sniff out the BS when you're, and he was really good at sniffing out the BS of coaches. And so I'm like, he might be a little too cynical to be a football coach. But there's that side of him that I've seen as he's a coach that, he doesn't try to be a BS artist. He's a very honest guy. And I think the approach that he takes, and probably what he's trying to do with the defensive line there, where I know you want to have a better pass rush, and hopefully Chubb makes a big difference with all of that, is that once you have guys that can control the line of scrimmage, even if they're not classic pass rushers, it just opens up so many other lanes and so many other opportunities for other guys. And especially if you can, these days where, man, teams are playing so much more cover two. And I think there's been more of a push, or there's more of a need to be able to stuff the run with 6 or 7 guys in the box than maybe there has been over the last decade, as you see the run game starting to come along. So it's all interrelated. And I think for him wanting to have a specific type of defensive lineman, because Jordan Phillips, I can see the violence in him. He's got the good football violence in him. I think for what he wants to accomplish, these seem like 2 good guys for the way he wants his defensive lineman to play football.
Yeah, and so you mentioned Jordan Phillips before, and you also talked about the idea of you going into a 3-4 defense and starting out as a defensive end. So the Jordan Phillips that we just drafted, so he's only 6'1" and only has 31-inch arms. Do you see that as a limiting factor in the NFL for his ability to play as a 3 technique or wider, playing in that 3-4 defensive end role? Or do you think just the raw strength and technique can help him succeed in those wider alignments?
I think he's an interesting one because he does all those things. He does a lot of the technical things really well. And there are guys, there's got plenty of guys that make it on offensive and defensive line that have shorter arms, or are just short in general, but they got to compensate for it somehow. And, with shorter defensive linemen who aren't super athletic, like an Aaron Donald necessarily, I always try to think of like Mike Tyson, who obviously was super athletic, but they turn that height disadvantage into a strength by just being able to get up underneath guys and just be lethal with their hands. And on the good plays where Phillips is playing with his hands really well, he's lethal. Like he's got that weird stance where he's super low to the ground. It's like a 4-point stance almost, with his legs really wide. And it looked like he does some genuine 2-gapping, which you don't see that much anymore either. Like where he was head up on the center, it looked like he was reading the center and doing a great job with his hands and getting up into guys. That's what, in the absence of extreme athleticism, he's just going to have to be nails with that. And then the other big part is because he's not a big guy. So for him, when you're a shorter guy and you go out and you play defensive end, you can play in a 4-eye, those NFL offensive tackles are so big. Like it's just that it's hard to overcome the height disadvantage sometimes. If he's playing inside, I could see him, if he can put on quality mass, maybe still being that guy that can stuff the run. But he's got to be hyper aware of all the angles. And there was evidence of that, when on powers and counters, he did a really good job at times where he was head up on the center and just saw the pulling guard, got his hands immediately into the play side guard. And that's the other part that you can make up for it a little bit, is like I was slow. I was plenty tall and long and all that, but I was slow as hell. So I had to be just nails on anticipating and using my hands and getting into guys. And he shows, like, he was probably drafted in the perfect spot. I know he was projected to be like a 6th or a 7th rounder or something, but there's something to him. I see some of these 4th and 5th round guys, and you watch him play in college, and you're like, all right, I get it. He ran a 4.95 40 or whatever, but he's not violent enough. With Jordan Phillips, I saw the appropriate violence, and it was heartwarming to see as an old man.
One of the things here, and just to switch gears just a little bit, one of the biggest, I guess, stories over the last 4 or 5 years for the Dolphins was back in 2021. Some of the supposed negotiations that were going on with Houston towards the end of the whole Deshaun Watson era over there, and kind of, as a member of the Houston media, could you just walk through what that entire time was like as there were the rumors of the Dolphins and Houston and these clandestine conversations?
Okay, you guys I might have to release you from the half-hour time limit, because every time I try to explain this, that whole year I was on so many shows in other markets just because people were so curious about it, and to try to sum it all up into one tidy lump, it was so weird. There was a day out there during training camp where they actually had Deshaun Watson wearing a penny for and being a defensive back on a scout team look during walkthroughs. It was like a walkthrough. It was so weird. And the organization is just kind of drawing a hard line and saying, well, nope, you're going to be out here. And I don't want to screw the timeline up. If I were a GM, I would have bailed on that so fast. I would have traded him to the Dolphins. I would have traded him to anybody else. Like, nobody knew what was going to happen. You had 24 civil suits. The criminal charges were still pending. There was just a lot of dodgy, I don't want to get into, the legalities of everything, but it wasn't a good look for Deshaun whatsoever. And I didn't know exactly what any team would be willing to really give up for him. And what was the report that the Dolphins were willing to trade? Was it a 2nd-round pick, or it wasn't much, was it?
It wasn't much. I believe it was about a second. Yeah.
I would have done it. I would have done it in a heartbeat if I were them. And it would have been a bad move for the Dolphins. But if I were the GM of the Texans, I was so stressed out about the whole thing. I didn't know if he was even going to be eligible to play football again. And but they stuck it out. And it was long, and it was dysfunctional, and everything was weird at the time. Remember, or at least previously, we'd had this guy named Jack Easterby who was kind of controlling everything from the shadows with Bill O'Brien. The biggest shock, honestly, for me out of all of that is that he's been so ineffective in Cleveland, because it makes sense in hindsight, given just probably the turmoil in his personal life and everything else. But everything we saw from him up until that point was nothing but, potential and improvement every single year. And he was a guy that genuinely cared about football. And it was doing a lot of things the right way. But I got to say, the Dolphins probably, I don't think this situation would have been different for him anywhere else. I think that at this point, you look at how everything's gone for him the last 2 years, and my co-host Sean Pendergast always points out, Deshaun's not a guy who's going to thrive being in the role of the villain. He's not that guy, and obviously he's vilified for a reason. It was, now the Dolphins wouldn't have given up as much, but I can't really, I guess there was a point where when the Browns came to play the Texans and it was Deshaun's first game back from suspension, I remember talking to a national reporter. It was Albert Breer, actually. And Albert Breer was at the game. And he said, I was actually kind of surprised that people weren't more vocal about Deshaun or really tearing into him. And I said it really wasn't because people liked Deshaun. It was mostly, from what I could tell, people were just tired of being a spectacle, because we were just like the extreme version of dysfunction for 2-3 years at that point, and people were just happy to be done with it. But it was weird. If I had to sum it up in a word, it was really weird.
I can say that I'm glad the Dolphins did not enter into that dysfunction, because we've had plenty of our own. So
what the
Seth,
hell's was Jonnu Smith? What the?
yeah, we'll get to that
I'm
one.
terrified of Jonnu Smith when they played the Texans this year. We're awful against tight ends. Yeah.
All right. So Seth, you said earlier, you were tall and slow, and that kind of sums up the third defensive tackle that the Dolphins drafted, Zeke Biggers, 6'5", 321, 35-inch arms. He's, a seventh round pick, not guaranteed to make the roster, but he's really got some physical attributes that you'd like to see develop. And I wanted to ask you, like, in terms of those, the backup defensive tackle guys, like, how important is special teams to a guy like Zeke Biggers in terms of making the 53?
Oh, that would be really interesting. With a defensive lineman, you usually, like, your duty on special teams might end up being mostly field goal protection, which sucks. I mean, you've never done it before. I can tell you from experience. I remember that was the first time. That was my introduction to the NFL. I was on field goal and PAT, playing tight end, and we were playing the Chiefs, and I lined up across from Derek Thomas, and I'm looking at Derek Thomas, and I was like, oh, he's not nearly as big as I thought he was, and that just blasted me. I think special teams maybe a little bit for him, but I think more than anything, especially with Weaver and as his coach, I think guys like that, if they show that they can grasp the technique and play with their hands and do all of those things where you can use your size to an advantage. If he doesn't, I don't know, Zeke might come in and just, blast away and just be making plays all over the place. But just by virtue of his size and his length, if he can show that he can get the technique and do what Anthony wants him to do, he's going to be intrigued by him. And the practice squad's being so big right now. It really, like, Anthony wants technically sound football players, and it's hard to find. I get frustrated when I see sometimes in a scouting report people say, like, well, he doesn't have good hands, but that can be coached. Like, well, most of these guys have been getting coached for a while. It's not, some guys just never get it. Ed Oliver is a good example of a guy that didn't use his hands well in college, and it took him a few years to really get it. Ed was a slow developing pro, and he started to get it, but it doesn't always come so quick or easy.
Yeah, it's really interesting when we get to have other teams, media members on the podcast, because you kind of get a feel for other teams in the AFC and kind of what the temperature is with those organizations. I found myself personally pretty impressed with what the Texans did in the draft. What's the general feeling over there with how the offseason's gone in Houston?
I think the biggest thing, if you had to touch a sore spot, it would be, okay, they needed to do something with the offensive line. We knew that. And they got rid of 3 of the starters from last year, including your old friend Laramie Tunsil. And so they checked off that box. They tore it down to the studs. Offensive line coach is gone. Bobby Sloic is fired as the offensive coordinator. And then I think everybody was kind of waiting for them to really go all out in free agency or via trade for offensive linemen, the way the Bears and the Vikings were both very aggressive in revamping it. And instead, the Texans just signed some, maybe journeyman plus caliber offensive lineman, but nothing to get excited about. Cam Robinson right now is the left tackle. And he's a solid player. He's not as good in pass protection as Laramie Tunsil, but he's a solid player at least. But there's a little bit of frustration or trepidation about, all right, CJ got sacked the second most times in the league last year. Then they weren't nearly his fault to the degree that, say, like Caleb Williams was. The offensive line, the pass protection was bad. Can just simply a new offensive coordinator and a new offensive line coach take a group of 5 guys that are relatively just average or above average and turn it into something better than last year? I'm personally optimistic that they can do that. Because there were so many things. And Coach, I don't know if you noticed this when you were watching the Texans. It was better by the time the Texans played the Dolphins. But there were just so many things this year where guys were doing fundamentally unsound things. And in the first half of the season especially. And then there were times where it felt like defenses were almost dictating what the pass protection would be. They'd line up in a look. Texans would check the full slide protection, then they'd send the blitz from the weak side, and it was just like clockwork almost how dysfunctional they were. So there's relative optimism that Nick Caley can hopefully just be a better offensive coordinator, but the offensive line is still a huge question mark. Just exactly what it's going to look like, and can they keep CJ clean?
Yeah, and you bringing up Bobby Sloic there kind of leads into my next question. And I think at one point during the 2024 season that you had mentioned that it was difficult to tell even what run concepts they were trying to block. And that was kind of the start of, the interactions that you and I had. So Coach Sloic coming to Miami as an offensive assistant, not necessarily tied to a specific position group. Is there anything from his 2 seasons with the Texans as the offensive coordinator that you'd like to see him, help to implement with the Dolphins?
I think with Sloic, it's interesting that he never was a specific position coach. Now, I'm sure he might have been like the quasi quarterback coach or something, or at some point. But like my overall impression of Sloic was that I think he is super bright. I think he knows exactly what he's talking about. He's not just some doofus that got the job by dumb luck. D'Amico Ryans was very impressed with him, but it felt like he was in over his head in being the guy in charge of everything. And I think that especially there was a disconnect, I think, between him and the offensive line coach. The offensive line coach had never really coached in a Kubiak Shanahan style system before. And as you know, like, running the outside zone isn't as simple as calling the plays. There's a lot, like those offensive linemen have to be smart as hell and be reading things on the fly. And there were just too many things that were too disjointed all over the place, where you could tell that there was a loss of focus on the fundamentals and on the execution. So I think there is something there in Bobby Sloic, and in his role in the Dolphins right now, obviously Mike McDaniel is going to be running the offense. I think he can be a valuable asset. I think like all of the things that made D'Amico hire him from his time together in San Francisco, you could see it. You could end up, he's probably hasn't had a press availability for anything. He's a really bright guy. I enjoy listening to him talk about football because he's got a broad education, and his dad was a coach in the NFL forever. I think he's going to be an asset for Mike McDaniel, and Mike McDaniel will know how to use him in some role other than just being in charge of everything, obviously.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into another question here, which is Mike McDaniel. Obviously, your last year in Houston, you kind of came over as an assistant with Gary Kubiak over there. Just talking about Mike as a young coach, I mean, was there any interactions there? Obviously, I know you were a defensive lineman, so there may not have been as much. But just talk about him as a young coach and kind of what you saw from him.
I don't think I ever had a conversation with him because he was there just the 1 year, right? And when Kubiak got there in 2006, I think that was the only year that we crossed paths. I went on IR early that year. I remember him from, holding the cards for the scout team, the offensive scout team and everything. And it was just everything you would expect. He was kind of like, who's this quirky little guy? I think I might I like that guy. But I never really had conversations with him. Robert Saleh was the guy on the defensive side of the ball who I felt like with Robert Saleh as a GA, I'm like, oh, this guy's going somewhere. This guy's awesome. He's just everything he is on the sidelines and everything. Like, he coached the hell out of the scout team. But with McDaniel, there was a whole bunch of guys that Kubiak brought in with him that, including Kyle Shanahan, that you could tell they were different than your normal football coaches, which I liked. It wasn't, I'd always had old school football coaches, and back in the day before they all got fit, they all looked like Andy Reid, and they were grumpy all the time. So it was kind of a breath of fresh air when Kubiak came in, because Mike McDaniel I could tell he wasn't wired like a normal I might not have realized he was like I said a grad assistant. I might not have realized he was quality control until like midway through training camp. But that was, I had limited interaction with him.
Sounds good.
All right, Seth Payne, thank you so much for joining us. And I got one last question for you, and this ties back into Mike McDaniel and Bobby Sloic. There were some inefficiencies with Mike McDaniel in calling the plays and the offense and just not adapting to situation. Similarly, with Bobby Sloic last season. And Sloic has mentioned that he's working with Mike McDaniel, Darrell Bevell, and Frank Smith, the offensive coordinator, to streamline and make it more efficient. considering the last 2 years with Bobby Sloic, can that actually happen for Mike McDaniel in Miami?
I think that's a really interesting question, because I know you guys have struggled through watching the same thing that we have, which is, man, there's times where you're like, would you guys please break the huddle and get up to the line of scrimmage and just take some time to diagnose and think, Tua could use a little extra time to maybe figure out what might happen post snap. The Texans had the same issue. And the question I always have, and this is where I always I tried to not throw a full body blow at Bobby Sloic at any given time, because you never know exactly, okay, is the quarterback holding them back, or is it the coaching and the procedure and everything? What it felt like to me, if I'm not going to blame CJ Stroud, who is still a very young quarterback, so it might very well have been partly on him, but in getting into and out of the huddle and up to the line of scrimmage and doing everything pre-snap, it felt to me like, man, this feels like a coaching staff that's trying way too hard to call the perfect play than to just go out and let guys play football. And that's a fine line. That's 5 or 10 seconds of maybe debate or looking at the placards and all of that. And Bobby, I believe, vocalized this himself, which was that they don't, the old Kubiak-Shanahan thought is, you don't need audibles because there's an answer in the play. And I think that's fallen by the wayside a little bit with how good defenses have gotten at disguising and just how diverse they can be. So I don't know if that's a systemic change they need to make. I know here, like, Nick Caley is talking to CJ Stroud, or talking about having CJ Stroud have more command at the line of scrimmage, and just giving a guy some time to get up and diagnose things pre-snap. And so obviously it can be done, but I think it's almost like a philosophical change as well. You got to empower your quarterback to take charge of some things.
Yeah. Thank you once again, Seth Payne. You can follow him on Twitter at Seth C. Payne on Twitter. All right, folks, before we get to the Jonnu Smith part of this section, we will head to break. Make this your best season yet with nutritious 2-minute meals from Factor. Eating well has never been this easy. Just heat up and enjoy, giving you more time to do what you want. Get outside instead of prepping and cooking indoors. Factor meals arrive fresh and ready to eat, perfect for any active lifestyle. With 45 weekly menu options, you can pick gourmet meals that fit your goals. Choose from Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, Keto, and more. Factor powers your day with satisfying breakfast, on-the-go lunches, premium dinners, and guilt-free snacks and desserts. It's easy to savor more this spring. Factor meals pack in the flavor with none of the fuss. Factor makes great dinner much easier, and with their portions, can be a tool to get fit for the summer. I'm a customer. Get started with factormeals.com/3yards50off and use code 3yards50off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. That's code 3yards50off at factormeals.com/3yards50off for 50% off plus free shipping. All right, gentlemen, that was a great first half of the show with Seth Payne. A lot of knowledgeable insight in terms of defensive line, Bobby Sloic, Mike McDaniel, and the entire Deshaun Watson saga. We thoroughly appreciate Seth taking the time out of his day to join us. The big news, that just kind of dropped a little bit of a bomb. We were expecting some sort of news from Jalen Ramsey coming from national media, but it was about Jonnu Smith saying that the Miami Dolphins and Pittsburgh Steelers are engaged in potential trade talks, as Jonnu Smith would like to rework his deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, obviously Jonnu Smith is coming off of the best statistical season of his career. And, in the NFL in 2025, it might be, especially for a guy that signed just a 2-year deal last offseason, maybe a little naive, I think, of people to just kind of assume that situation, that there was nothing, going on there in the background, because he was on a very good value deal for the production that he was going ahead and giving the Dolphins last season. And it's an interesting situation. It doesn't seem like the organization is going to back down as far as not going ahead and giving him more money. And so it seems like they've decided they'd rather work on a trade. Although I wonder if this is a situation where, maybe the organization is giving Jonnu permission to go out and seek that deal elsewhere where he may be able to get it. And I'm not sure that deal is out there currently for him, at least maybe not what he's seeking. So right now I'm kind of in a wait and see mode on it. Obviously this is not the news you want to hear in May, for the upcoming season, but I think when guys are given permission to seek deals like this, there's not always a guarantee that he's going to go and find what he wants when he does canvass the rest of the league.
Yeah. First I want to extend my gratitude to Seth Payne. Also really appreciate him coming on. For me, that was a guy that growing up playing Madden, like franchise mode, like I remember picking Seth Payne. That's where I first, heard the name and got familiar with him. So that's a really neat conversation to be able to have with him. But in terms of Jonnu Smith, right, that kind of, sideswiped all of us. And there was a lot of knee-jerk reactions on Twitter, including, myself. I'm like, what are they doing? But when you really step back and look at it, I think it's a scenario where both sides are, have a good case, right? Jonnu Smith, 30-year-old tight end, career year, right? Why shouldn't he ask for more money, right? And from the Dolphin side of it, even before this, rift or whatever you want to call it happened, right? I was under the thought process of, you let Jonnu play out this contract, and hopefully by 2026, somebody like Jalen Conyers has kind of stepped up into that role. Because I think when you look at the ideal scenario for this offense, right? Your tight end one is that George Kittle type that can line up in line as a threat as a receiver, and that F tight end is more of an afterthought, basically. So if it was a situation where we're just looking at giving Jonnu a little more money because that he earned it, right? He's the contract that he has right now is not at the value that he played at in 2024. If it was as simple as adding a few $1 million to 2025, I'd be completely on board with that. But I don't think that, Jonnu wants that. I think he's looking for a little more long-term security. I think he said that he wants to finish his career in Miami. And I don't think that, Miami is necessarily on that same wavelength. And you mentioned the idea of him going out and finding a trade partner. And one of my early thoughts on this process was, were they kind of at an impasse in terms of the contract negotiations to restructure his contract? And anywhere that he would get traded is going to go along with a restructure. He's not going to trade, somebody's not going to trade for him on the last year of this deal and just let him play it out and walk away. So my thought was, they give him this offer to go out and find a trade partner, knowing that he was going to negotiate a contract there as well, to really find out, without testing the free agent market, what are other teams valuing him at? And then, the last part of this that I had on it, the most recent thought that I had probably on it was, we know that the Ramsey stuff is coming here soon. Ramsey's got his countdown going. And, could there be a tight end as part of that transaction as well? And that is what has, kind of made Jonnu, I don't want to say expendable, right? But if there's an opportunity to add a tight end through the Ramsey trade, right, do you then, have to find somewhere for Jonnu to go in order for that one to happen?
I think reading up on everything, just initial, when I saw the tweet, obviously from Schefter, I was like, okay, this is interesting. Why are they trying to do this? Why would they want to do this? He was your leading tight end, Pro Bowl guy, made the Pro Bowl, only Dolphins player in the Pro Bowl, had over, I believe, 800 yards of receiving, which was a career high for him. He was a red zone threat. He made your offense better. He was another threat in the passing game when Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle weren't. And when things weren't going, the way they were supposed to compared to 2023, he was the outlet guy. He could be the one, gaining you the yards you need to get a first down. But then I take a look at it, listening to some of the offseason talk, listening to what the Dolphins are trying to do. There's going to be a little bit of a schematic change for this offense, and I think it revolves on not the tight ends being super dominant. I think the Dolphins are trying to get back to the 2023 version where the tight ends were pretty much non-existent in the passing game. They were more so geared toward run blocking. When I did my data, when I did my data deep diving in my research, Jonnu Smith was not as good in 11 personnel as everyone thought that he was. Good tight end for the Dolphins last year, career year as well, Pro Bowl. But it looks like the Dolphins are shifting more so towards that 2023 season where they dominated in 11 personnel and 21 personnel and had, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Devon Achane. Those are the main three core offensive guys. For now, it sounds like they're moving forward with Tyreek. It looks like he's going to be here for this season. So I think that's too much to feed. And if Jonnu Smith is asking, hey, I want a pay raise, I think this news that we're seeing, I don't think it's coming from both either the Dolphin side or the Steelers side. I think this is more so a leverage play from Drew Rosenhaus to get him the most amount of money he can for his client. You forget Rosenhaus is a pretty influential guy in terms of the NFL and especially the NFL media. Whatever he says, the insiders are going to tweet out, the local beat reporters are going to take it into account as, okay, there are things going behind the scenes. However, I listened to something from Pittsburgh and I read something that even the Pittsburgh media thinks that it's not coming from the team, where Jonnu Smith and his agent are trying to leverage his contract and his play, specifically with the Pittsburgh Steelers, where the now offensive coordinator is Arthur Smith, who was also the offensive coordinator for the Atlanta Falcons when he was in Atlanta, and also the Tennessee Titans. So just a bit of familiarity, trying to leverage this, drum up some interest. But Miami is not the only team receiving and making calls to improve their roster. There's 31 other NFL teams, including the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are calling and trying to see what offers are there to improve the offense or the defense, just like Miami's trying to do with Jalen Ramsey.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that you make about the offense changing, because I do think that there's something to the fact that the best version of this offense in 2025, unfortunately for a guy like Jonnu Smith, probably doesn't replicate his statistical production in 2024. If he's your leading receiver again, then chances are, something hasn't gone completely right in your offense. And then there's also, I think last season was the first year that we saw, a player who's more traditionally a tight end take that F role in the offense, like full time. The first 2 years under McDaniel, it was kind of piecemealed. You'd see different guys kind of taking that role on. And again, I just think that that's kind of a role offensively that the Dolphins think that they can have like 4 or 5 different guys kind of just do by committee. And I don't think that they would miss too much there. But Jonnu, to his credit, very good offensive player. I think somebody would be interested in him, as this carries on. But at the same time, even if it's just for red zone packages or, just to diversify your offense as much as possible, because you always want to be able to attack the defense in a variety of ways. I'd love to see him back in Miami. This isn't me saying, oh yeah, no, Jonnu Smith, I'd like to see him playing elsewhere. If it's a number that makes sense for both sides, I'm very open to a reunion still with Jonnu Smith.
Yeah, I think that was a good point that Hassan brought up there in terms of how did this get leaked out into the media. And Chris Greer has been very open in the past that, he's open to discussing almost any player on the roster that a team wants to call and talk about these, possible trade scenarios. And I think that we kind of knew that there was going to be at least some sort of discussions with Jonnu in terms of the contract. I think that, everybody knew that what he's slated to make in 2025 didn't represent what he did in 2024. So that part of it, I think, was expected. And the relationship there with Arthur Smith makes a ton of sense, right? So even though, this came out from Schefter and kind of blindsided everybody in Dolphins, world, it hasn't really come out like how serious the talks are, right? Was it a call from the Steelers that said, hey, I know you haven't, completed this contract with Jonnu. Is there an option here, right? And Chris Greer may have said yes, right? Like, what do you want to offer, right? If you're going to come in and give a second round pick for Jonnu Smith, then that's a no brainer, right? But not that the Steelers are saying that, but at the same time, like, we have no idea what type of compensations been discussed. All that we know is that there have been trade conversations, and I think that there are probably a ton of players on the roster that some sort of trade conversations have happened. But like Hassan had kind of alluded to, it comes down to who leaked that to Schefter, right? And it doesn't really make sense for the Steelers or the Dolphins to do it. The one that has the most to gain from that would be Jonnu Smith and his agent in terms of, really creating a stir among the fan base and creating pressure on the team to move forward and either get something done with Jonnu or, trade him to somewhere that will get something done.
Yeah. And always, folks, Coach Eric, thank you guys for joining as well today. We thank Seth Payne once again. Stick with us here on Scouting the Fins, part of the 3 Yards Per Carry podcast feed and part of the 5 Reasons Sports Network. As always, y'all, go Fins.